All right, everybody, make sure you have your note sheet ready. We're looking at our final installment of World War I, the end of the war, and eventually we'll get to the aftermath. What I first want to start with is this map here. As we take a look at it, notice how things have changed compared to earlier maps that we've looked at regarding this conflict. The Central Powers, formerly known as the Triple Alliance, doesn't contain Italy anymore. So we see Allied forces, including the United States, involved in this conflict, really surrounding some of the major powers who are fighting for the Central Powers. So let's start with this. So, the United States finally enters the war in 1917, 3 years after it starts, and as a result of that, the balance of the war tips in the Allied favor. Before that happens, events in Russia gave Germany a victory on the Eastern Front. The first thing is that in 1917, riots were breaking out in Russia over the government's handling the war and the scarcity of food and fuel. It's interesting as we take a look at the New York Times to the right, how some of these riots barely make a huge headline on the front page news. But this would not be the end of it. The leader of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, would be forced to give up or abdicate his throne, and the old regime was replaced by a provisional government in February of 1917. March of 1917. So for a few months, we would have Russia in a state of not really knowing what's going on or what is next, but there would be yet another revolution. And this would take place a couple months later in November of 1917. And effectively what this would do is that in the second revolution, the provisional government was removed and replaced with a Bolshevik or communist revolution. Now, I have this image here of this individual. This would be Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, who would establish a communist government within Russia, eventually it becoming the Soviet Union in 1922. One of the first acts of Lenin when in power is in 1918 is to sign a treaty with their enemy Germany that would allow Russia out of the war. It was known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and the biggest things that came out of it is that Russia would lose a little bit of territory, as we see here in the map, that pink area, and Germany would leave Russian lands. So we have the Allied powers now without Russia, primarily Great Britain, France, the United States, and a few other nations. But the United States made up for more than enough of what Russia would leave. 1918, the German military had also weakened, so this would, the treaty that took place with them in Russia would remove one side of the war. But back in the United States, President Wilson's gave a speech in 1918. Before I go there, I just want to show you that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was created in 1922, directly after Lenin coming to power about 4 years prior. And there's one other thing. It's kind of a strange thing that obviously is only in Moscow, that when Lenin died in the mid-20s, he was actually entombed, placed in a tomb and put on display. Even to this day, one could go Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. until the evening to see his body. It's kind of a strange situation, but it has become I guess we could say, a Russian tradition. There has been discussion of taking him off display, but for now he remains in the tomb. So as I was getting to earlier, by 1918 the German military had weakened, and not long after this was taking place, President Wilson gives a speech in January of 1918, and it lays out a policy for the post-World War. His speech went over 14 different points of what this post-world world would look like. It incorporated a few different things, such as free trade, open agreements, democracy, self-determination, so being able to determine your own government. So known as the 14 points speech, it was the only explicit statement of war aims by any nation who fought World War I. So there was no other document that had been created by any other world leader about what the post-World War would look like. Wilson's was alone. Germany said that they would agree to a surrender if Wilson's 14 points were used to negotiate a peace treaty. Unfortunately, that was not the case. We're not going to get too much into the battles, but we can come to the close of the war, and it was kind of strange because it fell on 11 a.m. on November 11th of 1918. So 11/11/18, the war is over, and an armistice or a ceasefire is signed. So as I mentioned, some of the highlights of the 14 points. So no secret alliances, freedoms of the sea, free trade, independence for Belgium, who was kind of in the mix of all of this, as well as Balkan nations, so those in Southeast Europe, and the creation of a League of Nations, kind of a predecessor to the United Nations. So, as with any war, a treaty is the final piece of it, which comes to give some closure. So, we have in this specific treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, the Palace within in Paris. The Big Four would be invited. So, Great Britain, Italy, France, the United States would be those who would be represented there, and usually meeting in this room here, known as the Hall of Mirrors, known as if you see all the mirrors on the right side of this room here. It took 6 months to negotiate a treaty, but there was a lot of different aims that various countries had going in. Great Britain wanted a balance of power, so some sort of equity within this treaty. France, who laid out the brunt of some of the damage that occurred within Europe, wanted revenge. They wanted they wanted land back, but they also wanted security, some buffer between Germany and them. Italy wanted territorial gains, and the United States wanted this League of Nations that would prevent future wars like this, as well as to incorporate the 14 points, which we'll examine in a little bit further depth. It was eventually signed in June of 1919, and it was very much so putting the blame on Germany. So realize that the war really began with the Austro-Hungarian Archduke being assassinated, but Germany themselves were put, the blame was put upon them. So they're forced to pay the Allies $33 billion over 30 years. They were supposed to accept the war guilt. They were supposed to surrender overseas colonies. They were to demilitarize, basically rid themselves of anything that would allow them to have any form of military or any branch of military. And they were to accept the League of Nations, all parts of it. We're not going to get too much into the aftermath right now. What we'll do, though, when we examine it, we'll see what is the United States like after all of this is done. When the troops are coming home, what does the conflict that we've been examining here do to affect the United States once the war has come to a close?